What's up YouTube? Today we are looking at the brand new Devious Machines Multiband X6 plugin. So a quick, simple explanation of the plugin would be a multiband compressor. Usually Devious Machines is known for stuff that's a little bit more creative. However, this seems to be more on the mixing side of things. That being said, it's definitely a Swiss Army knife of features with some really advanced high-end features in there as well. So just quickly before we get into the video, I want to give you guys the full disclosure. Devious Machines did contact me to have a look at this plugin. However, this is not a sponsored video. I'm using the same press demo that any of the other kind of press companies and stuff would be using. So essentially the license does expire. So then I can make the choice, do I want to purchase it or not? However, just playing with it for a few days, I'm pretty sure I'm going to actually pick it up because, like I said, it's a Swiss Army knife. One of the things I think is truly special is it's pretty much got everything. Sometimes there might be a compressor that you like that doesn't have one specific feature. So you end up looking through your library to find one that does. And sometimes it's very hard to find the exact one that you need. So yeah, I'm pretty confident to say that this has pretty much all the features that I've ever needed in a compressor. So it's probably going to be the one that I turn to most of the time. I'll probably end up making a ton of presets that have different styles of compression that I can quickly dial into. And I think just in terms of, searching through your plugin library and stuff like that, it's going to definitely speed that up in terms of the workflow. But anyway, without blabbering too much, let's dive in and actually have a look at the plugin. So like I said, this is a Swiss Army knife compression tool. This can be used both as a multi-band compressor with up to 6 bands. So how you would add these bands is by simply just hovering your mouse along the top of the GUI over here. And you can click to add up to 6 bands. You can remove them, you can move them, you can do all sorts of stuff like that. You can also remove all of the bands and just use this as a single band compression tool. So again, going back to that kind of really versatile system that I was talking about, this system starts to remind me a lot of Devious Machines plugins because their stuff is truly versatile. I think at first when I heard about the plugin, I was like, multi-band compression, we've seen this a million times before. But once I started diving into the kind of finer details of things, I started to notice where it truly shines. The versatility being one of them, the more advanced professional features being another. So there's another couple of other things about the plugin that make it truly intuitive. So one thing is that how it works is when you adjust these controls along the bottom panel over here, there's various ways of spreading the values across the bands. So let's say, for example, we want to quickly dial in the amount of ratio that all of the bands have together. We can just use the single compression knob at the bottom here. If we want to highlight specific bands, we can click this edit button, or we can hold shift and click another edit button. So we've now selected these two. Now we can dial in the compression value for these two. Now we can go to this one and we can dial in specific values for the bands if we need, or we can then dial the whole thing over here. Here's another really, really cool feature, which I don't think I've actually ever seen in a multi-band plugin before, is the tilt of values on each of these knobs. So what that is basically if we hold shift and drag, you'll notice how it tilts the compression algorithm either towards the low frequency or towards the high frequency. So this is a really nice way of, sometimes you've set up your compression, but it's either biting off a little bit too much of the top end or it's biting off a little bit too much of the bottom end, but you would want to redo your entire patch. You can quickly just tilt to change the balance a little bit. And I think this is pretty special because, often if you're just compressing and gaining, you end up with a bit of a muddy mess of loudness. Whereas if you tilt these things, you're kind of taking away and adding. So it just feels a little bit more natural than working with individual bands. But again, I guess that is more of a subjective thing. In this video, I kind of want to aim more at the features and the versatility. And, whether you like the sound of it or not, that's subjective. So the system of tilts works with all of the values. As you can see here, if we hold the release, we can see the release times along the bottom here also shifting. This is really cool because often you want a different release time for your low end compared to your high end, because obviously high frequencies resonate much quicker. Low frequencies have a bit more time before you can actually hear the tone of them. So being able to kind of quickly dial in the tilt like that is really, really awesome. Another really cool intuitive feature is this A/B setting over here. So let's say, for example, you've dialed in something that sounds good, but you're not sure. You might want to just fine-tune it a little bit more, but you always want to have something which you can quickly jump back to. So what we can do is, just excuse me, this mix was on 0, but there's no audio playing right now, so it doesn't actually matter. You know that whole meme, he's been tweaking the compressor for an hour on bypass. Anyway, so this A/B setting, we can quickly switch to another preset. Let's just call it a kind of like a safety fallback of settings. So now what we can do is we can fine tune this a little bit. Let's say adjust the tilts and all sorts of stuff like this. I'm just kind of quickly doing this. This is not actually going to sound good, I don't think, but this is just giving you an explanation of what you can do. So now we can quickly jump back between A and B and see which of these two presets sounds most suitable for the context material. You know, sometimes we may have overcooked it with A, but then dialing the settings back might just completely throw off what we've done. So being able to quickly jump back to that is really, really nice. What we can also do is copy settings to B. So say, for example, we now A/B testing between A and B, and we figure out, okay, B actually sounds better, or A actually sounds better, and we want to use that now as a new fallback point to carry on working, where we can actually copy either of the settings to A or B or vice versa, and now we can use this as the new starting point, carry on working a little bit more until we've got our desired results. So all of the settings can also be adjusted on the actual window over here, as well as using these more intuitive controls along the bottom here. So there are 4 dynamics styles in the plugin. These styles basically govern the entire frequency split. You can't have just a single band on expand and another single band on punch, for example. These settings govern the entire frequency spectrum. That being said, we have 4 different styles of dynamics. The first 3 being traditional compression, and the last one being an expander, which just inverts the behavior of the compression. So instead of reducing the volume beyond a certain threshold, it increases the volume beyond a certain threshold. So it goes back to that whole thing I was saying about being a Swiss Army knife dynamics processor. You can do all these types of things, from compression, limiting, all these kinds of dynamics processes, all the way through to backwards compression and that kind of thing. So the 3 compression algorithms are punch, which is similar to a digital style compression, smooth, which is the analog FET style compression, and then crunch, which states here it's the punchy compressor with analog style saturation of loud peaks. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the more advanced settings over here. We have this cog icon here at the bottom left. This basically governs the sort of audio parameters of the advanced settings, and then the one at the top right governs the metering settings. So over here, we have various different modes. We can have normal, mid, or side mode. We can choose whether it's linked or free. That's whether the channels act individually. We can choose various settings for the sidechain, whether we're using internal, external sidechain. We can filter the signal like this. So for example, if we're using an internal sidechain, we can use just the low frequencies to trigger the thresholds of the other bands and do some interesting stuff this way. Then we've got these advanced settings over here. We can set the plugin into linear phase mode, which considerably increases the phase response. I might show you a little bit later the difference here. Then we have a look ahead. This is really, really, really cool. What this does is it essentially delays the process of the plugin to give it a bit more of an accurate transient response. So essentially it reads the audio before it actually applies the processing to the audio, and you can choose the speed at which it does that. So sometimes, for example, with compressors, the transients are so sharp that the attack or the release of the compressor doesn't quite catch it in time. So being able to actually shift it, like using the look ahead to shift that process back in time, allows you to actually catch those peaks a little bit more accurately. This is something that you don't see in all compressors, and it goes back to that whole thing I was saying about being the Swiss Army knife. Sometimes you're dialing in these compressor settings and you're like, damn, I just need look ahead, and the compressor you're using maybe doesn't have it. And so you're kind of stuck. You have to then apply all of those settings that you had in that previous plugin into a new one, and it just becomes a little bit of a nightmare. And then we also have oversampling of 2x and 4x. Generally speaking, I leave this at 0. Generally speaking, when I'm doing this kind of multiband processing, specifically if I'm using linear phase as well, I will not use oversampling. I feel like the combination of linear phase and oversampling has a little bit too much of the post-ring effect that linear phase has. So, and also, I mean, most of the stuff that we're doing is generated, for my genre at least, is generated in the box, so I don't feel the need to oversample. That being said, having the choice if you need it, again, the Swiss Army knife compressor tool. So the plugin also has various auto settings, which allows you to quickly dial in some settings to get you started very quickly. Whether you want to use these or not, obviously, is up to you, but just having it at your disposal is just going to make your life a little bit easier. So they've split up the auto stuff into various different parameters. We've got the auto threshold. What that does is that you play some audio through it and it automatically detects what it feels is going to be the best threshold setting for you. You've got 2 auto gain settings over here. So one is multiband gain compensation. Essentially, it's as it explains it. Each band of the compressor gets auto gained individually. Or you have the wideband gain compensation. Essentially just takes the whole signal into account and gain compensates for that. And then at the very end of the chain, we have the level matcher, which is this little wand icon over here. Essentially what that does, that basically just matches the output volume to the input volume. So you can really hear what the compressor is doing without the loudness being a factor in your judgment. So the first thing that I would probably do with this plugin is I would let it decide the auto threshold for me, and then I would be able to dial it in from there. Like I said, these auto settings are for you to use if you want to, but it just helps you to speed up the process. So what we need to do is we need to hit auto, and then we need to play the audio for a couple of seconds. It's going to detect what it thinks the settings that we're going to need. In terms of doing mix or master processing, in this case, I would use the linear phase option just because it's not going to change the waveform. Without the linear phase option, often multiband processors tend to do a thing called phase dispersion, which I will outline a little bit later on in the video, where I'll show you what it's actually doing to the waveform. So if we want a more accurate phase response when we're doing these splits, it's important to turn linear phase mode on. What I also want to do is I want to set the look ahead to about 2 milliseconds. For me, it's my personal favorite setting for getting more snappier kick drums. Okay, so now what we can do is we can go in and solo each of these bands, start to dial in the attack and the release, or the actual frequency range that we want to work with. So for me, in these ranges, the sub and the low frequencies, I'm aiming for more transient and more punch in the compression, whereas with the rest of the sounds, or the rest of the frequency range, I'm generally looking for just a little bit more balance. The reason why I'm not really looking for too much punch in the rest of the frequency range is I feel like if everything is punchy, you don't quite get the punchiness of the low end, if that makes sense. It's all about that kind of contrast. for me, that's like really, really close to what I was going for. And to be able to dial in this type of accuracy so quickly is crazy. So from here, once we've got a good starting point, then what I'll do is I'll just start to tilt slightly. So for example, here I can feel like there's a lot of difference happening in the low end. I like it, but let's just play around a little bit with the tilt. Maybe we can get it to be a little bit more transparent by just adjusting this using the shift click. Okay, so here, notice the difference here between the multi-band gain compensation and single-band gain or wideband gain compensation. With the wideband, because there's a balance or a tilt happening in the frequency range, this suddenly blows out the low frequency. So being able to gain compensate each of the bands individually automatically is just so nice, because you don't suddenly have that like blowout of a certain frequency range. Everything just always sounds a lot more balanced. It's a little bit easier to work this way. Okay, let's check out some of these other modes. I'm not going to do the expand because you can just use your imagination for that one. It's going to kind of wildly throw off what we're doing here. But I'm going to show you guys the punch and crunch. This is actually really nice. It doesn't quite work in this context, but I can see how this can be really useful in the fact that you the compression governs the amount of distortion that's happening to the sound. So if you're compressing different frequency ranges differently, here, for example, it's only saturating that low end, whereas the rest of the track is sounding super clean. This kind of thing is very hard to imagine doing in a single process. I would imagine this thing often being done in the mix. And being able to really fine-tune it like this is pretty amazing, to be honest. Again, like I said, I don't think it quite works in this context, though. I think the smooth sounded the best, but still, that Swiss Army knife thing that I was talking about earlier, really, really, really cool. One last thing that I want to point out that I think is really amazing is how transparent this mix parameter is. So often with multiband processors, when you mix it, you can kind of hear this weird phasey thing going on because of the splits. So it might be due to the fact that the linear phase setting is on. However, I didn't notice this with it off either. So it still sounded very transparent mixing it. So what's most likely happening is they're doing some kind of calculation here, which is working out the amount of phase difference that's happening and mixing each band individually. I don't know, but I think that's pretty special as well. Okay, so now I just want to show you what I was talking about in terms of the phase dispersion. So let's open up Vital. What I want to do is set the phase randomization to 0. So each time it's re-triggered, it's the same sound exactly. Let's put in a single note. So with just the default settings, this white waveform over here is a representation of the output, whereas the red is the representation of the input. So, like I said, this is essentially what's known as phase dispersion. This is the effect that happens with any type of multiband split that's not linear phase. So, linear phase has pros and cons to it, and phase dispersion can be useful in a sound design context. But like I said, in terms of doing mix processing and that kind of thing, you may not want to wildly change the waveform, which could, do all sorts of other things to the entire mix. It can be cool to change the waveform of a specific sound, like I said, in the sound design context. But having the option of being able to turn that on and off when you need to, that's the key. So here, if we turn linear phase on, now I'm going to capture that waveform again real quick. Look how clean this is. So most of the time with linear phase, you have pre and post ring. I think it's just due to the nature of how well made this plugin is that it's just incredibly accurate. There's almost no post ring. From what I can see, there is a little bit of pre-ring. So that tiny little ramp that you see over there, just before this massive transient, that tiny little ramp there and at the end here, that's the extent of the pre-ring that we get with these settings. So like I said, incredibly well made in terms of the more professional high-end side of things, but also just super creative, you know what I mean? And super intuitive. Awesome, so that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, if you haven't yet, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Cheers.